First, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Sherry Russo, and welcome to the Ohio Connection to Hemingway and Idaho event. I am the Community Engagement Manager at WOUB Public Media, and we're really glad to have you all here tonight in the audience and our esteemed panelists here tonight to dive a little deeper into the life of Ernest Hemingway, which of course was inspired by the PBS documentary series. But before we get started on all that, we wanted to take a few minutes to tell you about the organizations who are here tonight, who were able to bring you this event this evening. Tonight's event is brought to you through a partnership between WOUB Public Media in Athens, Ohio, and Idaho Public Television. So right now, first, I'd like to introduce Mark Brewer, the General Manager at WOUB. Mark?
Hey, thanks, Sherry. So again, thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. I just wanted to say just a little bit of how this speaks to the power of public media. I mean, we all enjoyed a wonderful series that was shown all across the country just a few months ago. And then I got a email from my friend Jack Ellis, who I see here on the screen, asking if WOUB here at Ohio University was aware of a Hemingway connection with a notable alum. And that led to a phone call and an introduction, and then a great connection made with the community library in Ketchum, and of course a natural partnership with our friends at Idaho Public Television. So it's just amazing what public media can do. And then thanks to support from WIDA that helps bring us all together here tonight. Speaking of support from WIDA, I would be remiss if I didn't encourage all of you to support the power of public media as we all wrap up our current fiscal years tomorrow. Both WOUB.org and IdahoPTV.org have donate buttons on their home pages, or please support your local station wherever you're located at. We appreciate that very much. Again, thanks for joining us. I'm going to toss it over to my counterpart at Idaho Public Television, and that's General Manager Ron Pisaneski. Ron?
Thanks so much, Mark. Good evening, everybody. First, let me say thank you to Mark, Sherry, and the whole WOUB Public Media staff for putting together this wonderful event. You know, all things Hemingway are dear and near to the hearts of many Idahoans, so we appreciate the opportunity to be involved and to share one of our own films about his life. The Idaho Experience film that we'll see tonight, in addition to the clips from the Ken Burns Hemingway series, our film centers on the Hemingway House, Hemingway's time in Idaho, as well as the Writers in Residence program developed in 2019. Now, during the filming, we worked closely with Executive Director of the Community Library, Jenny Emery Davidson, who you'll hear from tonight, one of tonight's special guests. Jenny's also a wonderful friend, colleague, and a member of the Friends of Idaho Public Television Board of Directors. The Community Library of Ketchum is the custodian of the Hemingway House. We're also pleased to share with you several resources about Hemingway and the house, including a virtual tour, which you can find on our website at idahoptv.org/Hemingway. Now, our mission at Idaho Public Television is to, quote, harness the power of public media to encourage lifelong learning, connect our communities, and enrich the lives of all Idahoans. So tonight, we're pleased to connect to people and communities, not just in Idaho, but beyond, to continue the conversations on Hemingway, one of the greatest and most influential writers America has ever produced. And now I'm going to toss it back to Sherry to continue the program.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ron. We really, really appreciate that. And if you all can bear with me as I try to manage who's in the center, it's a little bit of a production here. But I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. Please always keep your microphones muted during the clips and during the conversation. There will be time periods where I will tell you all that you can unclip your mic or unmute your mic if you'd like to ask a question. Also keep your video off. That will provide less distractions during the event. And we will take audience questions for the panel at the end of each session with the panel. You can either send them to me directly in the chat, And the chat is set up to only go to the hosts of this event. So you can send your questions directly to me, or you can raise your virtual hand. So our agenda for the evening tonight, we're first going to view an excerpt from the Ken Burns Lynn Novick documentary series, which premiered on PBS in April, as well as watch an episode of Idaho Experience produced by Idaho Public Television, which focused on Hemingway's time in Ketchum, Idaho, and the Hemingway house that is there. Throughout the evening, as I said, we'll chat with our 4 panelists, who are Ohio University alum Van Gordon Souter from 1957, who was the president of both Fox News and CBS News during his career, but also spent time as the head of a committee that was in effect trying to find or become the manager protector of the Hemingway house in Ketchum, Idaho. Of course, Lynn Novick, who was the co-director of the Hemingway documentary along with Ken Burns for PBS. Jenny Emery Davidson is the executive director of the Community Library in Ketchum, which currently manages the Hemingway house. And we will also speak with Ohio University professor Gary Holcomb, who is a Hemingway scholar. So with all that being said, and without any further delay, we're going to watch a short excerpt from the Burns Novick Hemingway documentary that aired on PBS in April. This is the opening sequence of the documentary series and touches on the series' many different themes. So I'm going to go ahead and roll that now. Just give me a couple of seconds with technical things to get that started, and we will be ready to go.
Hemingway was a writer who happened to be American, but his palette was incredibly wide and delicious and violent and brutal and ugly, all of those things. It's something every culture can basically understand. Every culture can understand falling in love with someone, the loss of that person, of how great a meal tastes, how extraordinary this journey is. That is not nationalistic, it's human. And I think with all of his flaws, with all the difficulties, his personal life, whatever, he seemed to understand human beings.
You see, I'm trying in all my stories to get the feeling of the actual life across. Not to just depict life or criticize it, but to actually make it alive, so that when you've read something by me, you actually experience the thing. You can't do this without putting in the bad and the ugly as well as what is beautiful. Because if it is all beautiful, you can't believe in it. Things aren't that way. It is only by showing both sides, 3 dimensions, and if possible 4, that you can write the way I want to.
Ernest Hemingway remade American literature. He paired storytelling to its essentials, changed the way characters speak, expanded the worlds a writer could legitimately explore, and left an indelible record of how men and women lived during his lifetime. Generations of writers would find their work measured against his. Some followed the path he'd blazed, others rebelled against it. None could escape it. He made himself the most celebrated American writer since Mark Twain, read and revered around the world.
It's hard to imagine a writer today who hasn't been in some way influenced by him. It's like he changed all the furniture in the room. right? And we all have to sit in it to some, we can kind of sit on the edge of the armchair on the arm or do this, but, he changed the furniture in the room. The value of the American declarative sentence, right? The way you build a house brick by brick out of those within a few sentences of reading a Hemingway story, you were not in any confusion as to who had written it.
I can't imagine how it's possible that any one writer could have so changed the language. People have been copying him for nearly 100 years, and they haven't succeeded in equaling what he did.
If you're a writer, you can't escape Hemingway. He's so damn popular that you can't begin to write till you try and kill his ghost in you or embrace it. And I think I identify that most about Hemingway, is that he was always questing. The perfect line had not happened yet. It was always a struggle, trying to get it right, and you never will.
For 3 decades, people who had not read a word he'd written thought they knew him. Wounded veteran and battlefield correspondent, big game hunter and deep-sea fisherman, bullfight aficionado, brawler and lover, and man about town. But behind the public figure was a troubled and conflicted man who belonged to a troubled and conflicted family with its own drama and darkness and closely held secrets. The world saw him as a man's man, but all his life he would privately be intrigued by the blurred lines between male and female, men and women. There were so many sides to him, the first of his 4 wives remembered, that he defied geometry.
He was open to life, he was open to tragedy, he was open to feeling. I liked that he fell in love, and he fell in love quite a few times. He always had the next woman before he left the existing woman.
He was often kind and generous to those in need of help, and sometimes just as cruel and vengeful to those who had helped him.
I have always had the illusion it was more important, or as important, to be a good man as to be a great writer. I may turn out to be neither, but would like to be both.
Hemingway's story is a tale older even than the written word, of a young man whose ambition and imagination, energy and enormous gifts bring him wealth and fame beyond imagining, who destroys himself trying to remain true to the character he has invented.
One of his weaknesses, I was going to say failings, and it was a great pity. It's a great pity for any writer. He loved an audience. He loved an audience, and in front of an audience, he lost the best part of himself by trying to impress the audience.
I hate the myth of Hemingway. And the reason I hate the myth of Hemingway, it obscures the man. And the man is much more interesting than the myth. I think he was a terrific father sometimes. I think that he was a loving husband sometimes. I think he was like so many people, except this enormous talent. Hemingway is complicated. He's very complicated.
The great thing is to last and get your work done, and see and hear and learn and understand, and write when there is something that you know, and not before, and not too damned much after.
Hello, everyone. So welcome back. Now I'm going to pin our panelists to the center so that they can be the focus of our conversation. And there's so many people here that to wade through. Gary, I got to find you. But as soon as I do, we will get moving on this conversation. Well, first, while I'm trying to do that, I don't know if he logged off because I can't find him.
Yeah.
Gary, are you here?
I'm right here.
Okay. Evan, if you could help me and look for him and pin him to the center, I would appreciate that. For some reason, I can't find him. So let's get started with this conversation. So that was a wonderful clip that we just watched. Lynn, let's start with you. Tell me why you decided to make this film and just what makes Hemingway so fascinating.
Well, this project has been many years in the gestation. Ken had been thinking about potentially looking at Hemingway before I came to work at Florentine Films, and I came to work with Ken in 1989. So it's been something kind of, I would say, on a back burner as a potential project for many years. For me, I didn't know that. It was something Ken had been thinking about. I went to Key West on a vacation in the mid-90s, and it was something about being in the place where he had lived, like the house in Idaho, which I hadn't yet been to, being in the room where he worked, seeing his typewriter, thinking about the books I had loved, and the fascination with this man, and having kind of an epiphany, aha moment of, wow, we're looking for iconic American subjects that help us understand ourselves and the world, and it's hard to think of somebody better than Hemingway. Now, it took us a while to get around to actually doing it for a variety of reasons, to do with other projects that we had on the plate, and also the delicacy of approaching the family and not really being sure they would be open to giving us the access we knew that we would need to do a full portrait of him and his work. And as it happened, when we finally did reach out to Patrick Hemingway, he couldn't have been more gracious and saying, we really are grateful that you're going to try this. Good luck. It's a pretty tough, road to hoe because Hemingway is so complicated, as we say in the introduction. So we just sort of rolled up our sleeves and said, okay, we're going to do it. And it was important to us at the beginning and throughout that we viewed him as an extraordinarily important writer, as influential as any other American writer of the 20th century, for sure, and still enormously important. And that's why we wanted to make the film. And we also know that he lived an incredibly eventful life. And so trying to understand the human being who created this art, his complexities, his challenges, his flaws, and to really put it all together so that we didn't overweight the life or the art. And we found a way to kind of go back and forth and find the connections between them. Because I think everyone who's interested in Hemingway wants to know how much of what he lived made it into his work and vice versa. And the vice versa is even more interesting in a way. How much did he end up performing the role of being Ernest Hemingway in his life? And what did that mean about the work that he ended up creating? So that's in a nutshell why we wanted to make the film. Oh, you're muted, Sherry. Yeah.
Zoom gets me every time. Gary, you study Hemingway. Can you talk, but you're an African-American studies professor. So can you talk a little bit about what part of Hemingway that you study?
Well, while writing a book about a Black writer named Claude McKay, I came across a passage in McKay's memoir stating his unreserved esteem for Hemingway's writing, particularly the first collection of short stories called In Our Time, and then the famous Lost Generation novel, The Sun Also Rises. I was, intrigued by this. McKay was a Harlem Renaissance writer. He was, so the Harlem Renaissance took place during the 1920s, the same period that the Lost Generation, the so-called Lost Generation writers like Hemingway, Scott Fitzgerald, John Dos Passos, were in Paris. McKay, Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, and other Harlem Renaissance writers also lived in Paris off and on during the 1920s. And what I found is that critics had portrayed the two movements as existing independently of one another. But my research uncovered that the opposite was true, that Black and white writers and artists interacted intimately, sharing ideas, publishing in the same periodicals, exchanging friendly correspondence, hanging out in cafes together, attending the same functions. The writers of the Harlem Renaissance movement generally began with poetry and drama. It's typical that literary movements begin with poetry and drama. And then they went on to writing fiction. And when they did, they looked to Hemingway as their model. Black writers looked to Hemingway because his art was dedicated to getting at this sort of unadorned truth. They particularly liked the idea of depicting the casual violence of everyday human life. That really resonated with these Black writers. So Langston Hughes worked alongside Hemingway as a journalist in Madrid during the Spanish Civil War. Both were interested in exposing fascism. Later Black modernist writers, modernism is the period of the 20th century basically. Later Black modernist writers like Ralph Ellison, who wrote Invisible Man, looked to Hemingway for inspiration. Ellison claimed that he learned how to write fiction by literally typing Hemingway's short stories verbatim. So I co-edited a collection of essays that explored both Hemingway's representations of ethnic, immigrant, and Native characters, as well as I was also interested in how Black writers like Hughes, Ellison, and Baldwin, James Baldwin, responded to Hemingway. And later on, I put together another book on teaching Hemingway in the multicultural classroom. So this leads us to the point about, the question of that Lynn Novick and Ken Burns' film addresses very well, this whole problematic of question of language use in Hemingway. So Hemingway's writing about ethnic and other non-white peoples can be troubling, especially in his letters. So the point is not to apologize for or excuse him. As students of 20th century literature, our task is to understand the complexity. This is the favorite word of Ralph Ellison, in fact, the complexity of literary history. So my point is it's important to keep in mind that the novel that Hemingway describes as the most pivotal work of American literature is Twain's Huckleberry Finn. The theme of Twain's novel is recognizable to Hemingway readers. Male characters on the margins of civilized society, the white boy Huck and the black slave Jim. In order to understand Hemingway's use of the N-word, right, we should look no further than the influence of Huck Finn, which uses the word over 200 times. Hemingway understood that this word employed, however responsibly, that's up to the reader and critics and so forth to decide. So my point is that Hemingway understood that the word is inflamed with symbolic power, and no other word in American English can come close to its impact, thus its interest for white writers like Hemingway.
Wow, okay, thank you so much for that. Lynn, I want to take it in a little bit of a different direction. Idaho is brought into this documentary due to Hemingway's fascination and love of the natural world, fishing and gaming, etc. Why was that such an important part of his story to tell?
Well, you can't really, in addition to all the really interesting things that Gary just said, which is very important, and we could talk about at great length, and perhaps we will later, but I think it is important just if you're going to understand the entire human being, his relationship to the natural world is very important. And it starts when he's a child growing up in Oak Park and then spending his summers in Michigan in the countryside, I guess I would say, not in a suburban environment, and his love of hunting and fishing and his sort of fascination with the natural world, with animals and birds and fish and their life habits. And, if you're going to hunt, you have to understand the animals that you're trying to secure. So, the impulse for conservation and being a naturalist, an amateur naturalist, he comes by very easily from his childhood. And we have lots of photographs of him as a child interacting with nature. And I think he's also acutely aware of the loss that relationship with nature comes with it, in seeing the devastation of the landscape and seeing animals killed and seeing how man strides across the land and sometimes destroys it. And there's, he saw that in World War I at a human level, but he sees it in terms of nature and what people can do to the land. So all that to say that it's a lifelong relationship for him. And we did my colleague Sarah Botstein did a wonderful conversation with Jenny a few weeks ago, or when the film came out, with Terry Tempest Williams, and she spoke about Hemingway's the only thing he ever really loved was the natural world. And I have to say that really struck a chord with me. So, there's something very profound. And I would venture to say, and there are many people here who might disagree with me, but Hemingway doesn't seem to be particularly observant in terms of a religious context. So the natural world really is his temple to some degree. So, you know, it's a profound part of his being. And the other part of that we could go on at great length about is, you know, his fascination with death. And you see that in nature. So as a young child and growing man, he saw that. You know, you see animals, you kill them, you see them die, you understand mortality, and thus his fascination with the bullfights. So it's a long way of saying that his relationship to the land and to nature is essential. And he spent a lot of time in Idaho before he moved there, and in Wyoming and in the West. And so that's a particular landscape that touched him very deeply and that he had a really lifelong bond with.
Okay, so Van and Jenny, I'll start with you, Van. Why do you feel that Idaho was so important to Hemingway, and why is Hemingway now so important to Idaho?
Well, he got to Idaho almost inadvertently. He and Martha were living in Wyoming, and the Sun Valley Lodge, in effect, hired him as a celebrity guest, like a celebrity chef. So he and Martha packed up the car in Wyoming, were driving down to Sun Valley, and when they were about 2 hours out of Sun Valley, they drove into one of the most heinous portions of Idaho, this great lava bed community where it's like 110 degrees on Christmas Day. But whatever, they were doing it in the summer on a very narrow road. It was incredibly hot. The landscape was barren. And the two of them decided if they could turn the car around, they'd go back to Wyoming. But their car was too wide to turn around on the narrow road, so they had to continue to Sun Valley. I think everything that was just said about his respect of nature is so true. And I think it's also true that it may be that the only thing he treated with fidelity was nature, because he'd lost family, friends, product, with whatever, in sometimes ghastly ways, but he was always true to nature. The town loved him because in those years it was a tiny village, and suddenly one of the most famous men in the world begins to surface on a regular basis as a guest of the lodge. And if you went into one of the bars, you would not be surprised to see Gary Cooper and Ernest Hemingway downing shots at the bar. I mean, he was an instrument of presence in that very simple town. The only other celebrities were a few skiers and also Averell Harriman, who created the lodge. And perhaps his give and take relationship to the town became most evident when the best guide in the valley, fabulous hunter, great fisherman, was out in a boat going for duck, and one of the guests, very new to firearms, shot and killed the guide in this little boat. And it was a tragic event in the small town, and they decided to do a memorial. And of course, Hemingway had to participate. He sat down and wrote an astoundingly beautiful tribute, not just to this man, but to Idaho and the nature of Idaho. And then, like Hemingway, he went out and tried to get the druggist, one of the bartenders, to read it at the memorial event. And of course, they all said no. And he was forced to go and do it himself. And so much of what he wrote in that tribute is not only about the dead guide, it's also about Hemingway himself.
Jenny, do you want to take a stab at answering that question about why Idaho was so important to Hemingway and now Hemingway is so important to Idaho?
Well, as Lynn and Van have described so well, I think that in some ways, Hemingway got to be the best version of himself, or a version of himself that he himself was most compelled by when he was in nature and in wild places. I think it is where some of his strongest friendships were forged. And these were often kind of gritty, scrappy relationships and friendships. So to give a sense of how he matters to Idaho now, not too long ago, a woman came to the library here and brought a book for us to see. It was For Whom the Bell Tolls, not a first edition, a later edition. But this book had been in her family for decades now, because her family had a ranch outside of the little town of Richfield. I mean, this is a dusty town in the high desert area. And Hemingway went down there with friends to hunt birds and to shoot rabbits. And the family came to expect him to come each fall and would put on a big picnic. And he developed a real friendship with them and a fondness with them. And so this book he gifted to them, he wrote a letter to the family in it. And then everybody who was a part of the hunting party that day, including Mary Hemingway, including Gary Cooper, had all signed the book. And this family had saved that book, not so much because of the piece of literature that it was, not so much because Hemingway is the great writer that he was, but because it seemed to provide some kind of affirmation to them of how their family had mattered to him, and a friendship that they had enjoyed in a particular period of time. And I think there continues to be that sense of connection here in Idaho to Hemingway's legacy, because those were the kinds of friendships he made here. In some ways very simple, around outdoor excursions, but deep and enduring.
Okay, and last question we'll give to Lynn before we go into our next clip. Tell us about the time that you spent in Idaho and that your team spent in Idaho when putting together this documentary, and the access you were given to Hemingway's home.
Yeah, well, I mean, I will say I have, over the course of my own life, made several trips to Sun Valley to ski, and always known that Hemingway had lived there and never had been to the home. And my colleague, Sarah Botstein, the producer of the film, had been to Sun Valley for the Writers' Festival with her then husband, probably 7 or 8 years ago. And she had gone to the home and sort of scouted for us and been to his grave, and kind of came back with, we have to go there, we have to film this place. So we went with a camera crew for an extended visit, and Jenny and her colleagues were incredibly gracious to let us be in the house at different times of day, when the public, when before dawn, after dusk, and in between, and to film from inside and outside. And just, they even brought a typewriter that he had used, an original typewriter, so we were able to film that in place on his desk. And, I mean, as I sort of started by saying, for me, this whole project began when I went to the home in Key West. Over the course of the project, I also was able to go to his home in Cuba. And, it speaks to, this is a real person. He lived in these real places. He wrote these incredible works on this typewriter and with this pencil. I mean, there's something tactile and real. And it's very difficult to make someone like Hemingway real, because he is larger than life. He can become flattened and two-dimensional because of his celebrity and the way he constructed this myth of himself as this hyper-masculine guy. And so to sort of touch the real Hemingway in different ways for us, there's a lot of different ways we try to do that as filmmakers. Part of it is meeting people who knew him. Part of it is reading his letters. And part of it is going to the places that mattered to him and where he spent time and trying to connect with him. So being able to spend time in his house in Ketchum was priceless, truly priceless. That's one of the great privileges of my work, is to be in very special places. And, to have the camera try to capture what you feel when you're there and bring it back and put it in the film. So we're so grateful to the library for making it possible for us to do that and to share that, with millions of people who got to see the film.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lynn. I guess that was the perfect lead up to our next clip. As you know, two of our panelists have a connection to the Hemingway House in Ketchum, Idaho, and have worked very hard for its preservation. So now we're going to watch an episode of Idaho Experience that is about the home and Hemingway's time there to help us understand why this house is such an important piece of the Hemingway story. Once again, give me a second to get everything fired up. If you could please mute your mics and turn off your cameras, that would be great, and we will get this started.
Major funding for Idaho Experience, provided by the J.A. and Catherine Albertson Family Foundation, making Idaho a place to learn, thrive, and prosper, with additional support from Ann Balakay and Louise Nelson, and Judy and Steve Meyer, the Richard K. and Shirley S. Hemingway Foundation, the Friends of Idaho Public Television, the Idaho Public Television Endowment, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
He wanted to write like Cezanne painted. We don't know when Mary taped that reproduction on the closet door, but it has a connection to Hemingway and to his work and what he wanted his work to be.
That's Hemingway at his best. He's with the people he wants to spend time with. He's produced the book. He's reclaimed his reputation as a writer. That's how I like to think of his time here in Idaho.
What I felt lived on was the power of his creation and his love for the wild beauty of that land, that community, and that house.
Everyone can connect with this house and with Hemingway's greatness. He was ill. He had suffered a great deal, 9 concussions. He needed a refuge. That's what this house provided. And that's a great gift for a writer.
Ernest Hemingway was already famous when he came to Idaho in 1939 to lend his celebrity to the new Sun Valley ski resort.
He was invited, as many celebrities were invited by Union Pacific, who owned Sun Valley Resort, and they were trying to create a glamorous destination that would attract people who wanted to be around glamour.
Hemingway would return, usually to hunt birds in the fall, for the next 2 decades. He bought a furnished home along the Big Wood River in 1959. Hemingway homes in Cuba and Key West, Illinois, even Arkansas, are museums today. The Ketchum home is instead a haven for writers and researchers, and it remains largely as it was when Mary and Ernest Hemingway lived there. They're everyday objects alongside art that reflects the most important friendships and influences.
Something that we find really touching about the collection of objects that this house holds is how a lot of them seem to have been treated with a degree of familiarity. These things like the watercolor by Dorothy Shakespeare, the paintings by Waldo Pierce that remain unframed, like the books inscribed by Archibald MacLeish and Thornton Wilder that are just set on the shelf. These are things that he carried with him from Paris to Key West to Cuba to Ketchum. And so they really seem to
bear witness to the friendships, the relationships that he held close.
When he killed himself here in July 1961, Hemingway was at work on the book that would become A Movable Feast. The title references holidays or feast days that move on the calendar.
The title of A Movable Feast, which is drawn from Hemingway saying, if you're lucky enough to live in Paris as a young man, then wherever you go, it will stay with you because Paris is a movable feast. And the fact that he's at the end of his life, but he's in that home in Idaho, and he's thinking back on those days in Paris, the movable feast stayed with him. Those days when he was forming his art. When you think about the Cézanne and the Miro and Pierce, which is of course the bullfights, again in the 20s, they all sort of connect, don't they? They all tell that narrative of him.
Hemingway studied many artists. He said he learned the power of repetition by listening to Bach. But the biggest influence was Paul Cézanne.
He was able to draw from art as he was first coming up with his own language, his own way he wanted to write. Here he is as a young man walking through the museums and thinking about how he wants to add dimensions to his story, and he tells Gertrude Stein, I want to write landscapes like Cézanne, and eventually did.
This print, taped to the closet in Idaho, is not just any Cézanne. It is of Mont Sainte-Victoire, one of a series that Hemingway would have seen in the 1920s in Paris museums and in the Paris home of his mentor, Gertrude Stein. From Cézanne, Hemingway learned to break down form in his prose, play with depth and focus, color and light. Hemingway's first and most prized painting was The Farm by his friend Juan Miró. In its simplicity and directness, some scholars see a parallel with Hemingway's own desire to distill and compress his prose. Hemingway gave the painting to his first wife, Hadley, as a sort of parting gift when he left her for his second wife, Pauline Pfeiffer. The painting has a long, complicated story involving two powerful American museums, a serious restoration job, and a clandestine trip out of Castro's Cuba. After Hemingway died, the painting became the subject of a legal fight between Hadley and Mary. In 1963, Mary paid $25,000 to settle Hadley's claim. The original hung prominently in Mary's New York apartment, and this worn copy, clipped from a magazine, was taped up in Mary's bedroom.
It's quite the story. So that, the fact that it's in Mary's powder room speaks both to how much it meant to Hemingway, but probably also that journey that, she insisted that she keeps that painting.
Just months after fighting in court, Hadley sent Mary a postcard.
And it says to Mary, I remember this day, love Hadley. And the day is, of course, Hemingway's birthday.
The courage of that gesture from one woman to another to reach out and recognize a common sorrow. It's been little things like that, to me, make all of the characters that have inhabited this house a lot more human.
After Hemingway killed himself in 1961, Mary lived in their Ketchum home another 25 years. In truth, it's Mary's home. Her clothes still hang in her bedroom closet, and the notes she taped to the walls remain.
Mary was notorious for taping things up. There are pictures of the windows with Christmas cards taped all over them. In the laundry room, there remain notes that she received from friends, jokes, cartoons, and there's a kind of familiarity and casualness to that that I think is very heartwarming.
Mary Welsh grew up an adventurous child in northern Minnesota. She landed a job as a reporter with Time magazine covering World War II. She met Hemingway in London, and they married in 1946. Writer Judith Freeman was a newspaper reporter in 1972 when she was assigned to collect a recipe for an article on Sun Valley celebrities.
Well, I was very young at the time, and I don't think I understood then how many wives of famous artists and writers, who were also artists and writers themselves, were going to be completely overshadowed by the men that they married. And I hadn't realized that Mary Hemingway had had a career as a journalist. But I think when she married Ernest, she gave herself over to the care and nurturing of Ernest. And in many ways, she, I think, was the wife who he needed the most at the time in his life when he needed a real friend, and she was that friend. She had this strong, vivacious spirit, which is, I'm sure, in part what Hemingway was attracted to. The biographies that I've read said he was actually a pretty sweet guy, pretty kind guy who could be very generous. I think he could be terrible to his wives as well. I think, you know, he had both sides to him. She at the time was 64 years old. This tiny, little, vivacious, attractive woman who was so friendly. Anyway, the photographer took a few pictures out on the deck. It was 11 o'clock in the morning, I remember, and she said, "I think we need some champagne, don't you?" I was like, okay. And she opened a bottle of champagne, and we came in here, not to the kitchen, but into the living room, and I sat down and I listened to Mary talk about her life. And I was happy to listen to her stories, drink her champagne, sit in this wonderful place, share her memories, and then after about an hour, I asked her for the recipe that I'd come to get, and that was my first time in this house. She ended up giving me a recipe for hamburgers made with any kind of wild game. That was Ernest's favorite. He liked it very crispy on the outside and almost bloody rare on the inside.
The house was at the edge of Ketchum when it was built in 1953 in the style of the Sun Valley Lodge. Businessman Bob Topping built it for entertaining with projectors and a movie screen. The Hemingways entertained there too, with the circle of friends Ernest Hemingway called the family.
These are, common people, hunting guides, fly fishing guides. I think that's why he called the people the family. This was a conclave of individuals who are expert at what they do. He was buried here in the Ketchum Cemetery, which tells a story. He's surrounded by not only his family, but also the family of hunting guides. Lloyd Arnold, Gene Van Gilder, Taylor Williams, the Atkinsons, they're all surrounding Hemingway's grave. So as you walk around the cemetery, that tells a story. He never wrote about the Sun Valley area. Some people have opined so that he wanted to protect this place. This was a place that he wanted to escape from celebrity. He wanted to be able to spend time with the people that he revered here and who didn't treat him like a celebrity. They weren't interested in his books.
But Sun Valley did find its way into one Hemingway novel.
And so he came over in 39 with 12 chapters of From the Bell Tolls, and in chapter 13 he works Sun Valley into the book. Robert Jordan says if we make it through this war, maybe we'll be Mr. and Mrs. Robert Jordan of Sun Valley, Idaho.
For 20 years, Phil Huss has taught a course on Hemingway at the Sun Valley Community School. In 2020, he published a book about Hemingway's time in Idaho and what it tells us about his art, his life, and the code he lived by. Hemingway prized mentors, like his Idaho hunting companions, men who were masters at their craft, who saw nature as an arena in which to behave honorably.
And there's a reason that Hemingway created these characters, and it comes from his experience with war. It had its effect on his religious faith, it had an effect on his belief in the world. If you can't control these forces like war, then you must control what you can control, and that is how you conduct yourself in the world.
When Mary Hemingway died in 1986, the house and 12 acres went to the Nature Conservancy. The community library took ownership in 2017. Its multiple Hemingway programs include research and study of the house and its artifacts, an annual Hemingway seminar, and a growing collection of Hemingway materials. A recent addition is the donation of 4,000 Hemingway-related items from collector David Meeker. Library leaders see the Hemingway legacy, and now the Hemingway House, as a way to promote not just Hemingway's contributions, but the broader literary culture of Idaho.
I think it's really significant that Idaho was a creative space for him. And I think because he continues to be such an iconic figure, that he provides an invitation for us to think about how Idaho can be a creative space, has been and can be for lots of different people.
The centerpiece of this larger literary effort is an artist-in-residence program that hosts writers for extended stays in a new basement apartment at the Hemingway home. The first dozen resident artists have spent their time writing, thinking, and participating in community library events. Richard Blanco, President Obama's 2013 inaugural poet, hosted workshops for aspiring writers at the Hemingway House. The weeks Blanco spent at the house gave him insight into Hemingway's life and mental decline, and his struggles after depression and alcoholism and electroshock therapy left him all but unable to write.
It became much more real to me in that respect. Something about how terrifying, it was for him to sit down or stand up to write, that he would just tell himself, I just want to write one true sentence today, just one true sentence. And God, could I relate to that? And the terror of it too, so hey, if Hemingway was scared, I can be scared too.
Actor, film writer, and producer Naomi McDougall-Jones and her husband moved to Ketchum in 2020 after falling in love with Central Idaho during her Hemingway residency.
Idaho is beautiful, and I think there's something really to be said for being an artist in a place that fills you up and does give you inspiration and creativity and space. I think that's a lesson of Hemingway. He did that. He constructed his life so that he would be in places that gave him artistic nourishment. One of the things I have come to admire the most about Hemingway is that he took himself 100% seriously as an artist. He believed in his own greatness. He constructed his whole life around giving himself the best chance of creating great art. And there was a confrontation with myself through Hemingway that happened in this house that has changed the level of seriousness with which I take my work, and is part of, I think, why I moved back to Idaho.
Naomi McDougall-Jones has also become an activist, known for her TED Talk and book about Hollywood's systemic discrimination against women in film.
One of the great gifts of being here in this house was being able to live with Ernest Hemingway as a human being. Being who I am, I thought a lot about that sort of overemphasis on masculinity and patriarchy does also destroy the men that it seems to help. That by removing the nuance and forcing them into this performative thing, it destroys them as well.
Cheryl Strayed is the author of bestsellers Wild and Tiny Beautiful Things. Her friends and collaborators include Oprah Winfrey and Reese Witherspoon, who played Strayed in the film version of Wild. She spent November 2020 writing at the Hemingway House. She understands the burden that celebrity placed on Hemingway.
The challenging part of fame is that what made you famous really began with you very, very quietly working alone in a room. The work doesn't change just because people's response to it does. What you have to do is the same thing you did at the beginning, and that is stay humble, stay true, do the work, overcome the voices, show up at dawn, work till noon. You know, whatever your version of that is, you have to do it.
Like Hemingway before her, Strayed has redefined the genres in which she writes. In Wild, her memoir about hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, Strayed flipped the adventure story on its head, writing about a woman alone in the wilderness.
The stories that were told about solitary people who went into the wilderness have almost always been men. And so I knew that tradition. I wanted to tell the true story of what happened to me, a woman, in the wild. What did I find? What did I face? And so I was writing both with and against a narrative tradition that I was deeply aware of. And Hemingway was part of that.
Writers come to the residency to spend time on their own work, but all end up reckoning with the complexities of Hemingway, the writer and the person.
I'm always struck really by his empathy, by his ability to pierce through that kind of veneer of masculinity and show us his characters in a vulnerable and real way. He's writing about these men who have been through the war, they've been wounded, they're trying to heal. They're not able to talk about healing in open-hearted ways. He shows characters who are struggling to say, I'm in pain, I'm hurting. And that's what I think about when I think about Hemingway. So much of that fishing and hunting and going off to war, that's like the sort of surface level of Hemingway. And then all of the heart, all of the emotion, all of the pain and suffering and endurance and triumph is beneath that.
Listening to the Big Wood River, looking into the distant Boulder Mountains, also lets the writers connect with the landscape that inspired Hemingway.
The quiet, the solitude, a certain peace and energy that I'm feeling very comfortable writing around. I mean, just sitting in the porch here and like listening to the river, that's something that I'm taking with me for sure.
The natural landscape here is significant for all kinds of ecological reasons, and it also was super significant to Ernest and Mary Hemingway. So there's the house, there's the landscape, and there's the sense of this being kind of a sacred spot. We kind of need spots that we are reverent toward, that do not become commercialized or become a spectacle. And the fact that Hemingway died by suicide here is something that we don't want to gloss over. You know, the fact that Mary, his widow, continued to reside in the house for another 25 years suggests that this, more than a place of death, was a place of healing. and a place of sanctuary. And perhaps the best way we can honor Hemingway's legacy is to preserve that sense of sanctuary that the house and Idaho was to both of them.
One other place of sanctuary figures prominently in Hemingway's Idaho story. Jean Van Gilder worked for the Sun Valley Resort and became Hemingway's friend and hunting companion. When he died in a hunting accident in 1939, Hemingway was shaken and angered. The careless accident violated everything he believed about performing honorably and well in the outdoors. Hemingway hated to speak in public, but Van Gilder's widow asked him to give the eulogy.
And he decided to do so, and he wrote a beautiful eulogy that's at the bottom of Trail Creek Memorial.
Best of all, he loved the fall. The leaves yellow on the cottonwoods, leaves floating on the trout streams, and above the hills, the high blue, windless skies. Now, he will be a part of them forever.
And the he is Jean Van Gilder. But I always like to say, you could apply that to Hemingway. Now he'll be a part of this place forever.
All right, welcome back, everyone. I think we all learned a great deal about Hemingway and Idaho, and now we're going to get back with our panel here. Jenny Emery Davidson from the Community Library, Van Gordon Souter, a 1957 Ohio University alumnus and someone who worked on the effort to preserve the home, and Gary Holcomb, an Ohio University professor. So thank you all for coming back. Let's start with you, Van. Tell us about your time on the committee that tried to preserve the Hemingway house. How did you get involved, and why was that so important to you?
Well, I was dragooned into it. I had absolutely no desire to do it other than writing a check. The Mary Hemingway, in effect, gave the house to the Nature Conservancy, which is a fabulous organization preserving wild, open country around the world. Running a little house in Idaho, they were totally incompetent. And they knew that. But no one could figure out what to do with the house. A group of locals said, well, why don't we create a committee and work it out? And I became chairman of that committee. And we set off to create public access to the house, not in large buses, but a system where over a period of time, maybe 2 small vans a day could gain access to the house, which would have been lovely for the people who live in Ketchum and Idaho. The area around the Hemingway house has been built up to some degree, and the only way one could get access to the Hemingway house was to pass these big homes with occupants who had large-time lawyers. And as we went to the city of Ketchum to get permission to create a system where we could have people visit the house, the neighbors opposed it and prevailed. And that was Idaho's a state that feels very strongly about property rights. And that was the end of it. And the house went back to the Nature Conservancy. Fortunately, through some magic I'm not aware of, it all got tied up with Jenny. And Jenny is not only a fabulous administrator, she's great at marketing, and she began to develop a discriminating way of protecting and using the house, which would have been far better than which is far better than what we had anticipated.
Stupid mute button gets me every time. Anyway, awesome. Well, that was a great introduction to Jenny. So Jenny, tell us about this magic. How did the community library come to manage the Hemingway House?
It really was thanks to work that Van had led before. That laid the groundwork for how we could even think about Hemingway's legacy in Idaho. Van has referred to Idaho as Hemingway country, and that phrase has always really resonated with me. And to think about how the house is one piece of that story. We were at a different, just time had passed and work had been done, and we were in a position to think about the house and Hemingway's legacy differently. The Nature Conservancy had approached the community library because we have a regional history department. Several of the library's founders were among Hemingway's closest friends in Idaho. So we felt like the library's DNA was kind of shared with Hemingway's DNA to some extent already, and it started to feel like a very natural thing for the library to become the custodian of the house. We have really used as our guiding light over the last 4 years, having been the owners of the house, Mary's phrase in her will that she wanted the house protected as a nature reference library, which is such a simple phrase, but really one that is very evocative. Suggests that the landscape is as important as the house structure. That it's something to be used for seeking knowledge. So early on in our considerations of the house, we were very clear that we did not want the house to be a spectacle. We recognized that there was a lot of research yet to be done around the house. So it holds many artifacts. I mean, all of the artifacts of daily life from Mary's time there and from Hemingway Ernest's time there before her. So everything from teacups to hunting bags to suitcases to Mary's clothes to, all kinds of objects. And so we are really engaged in a long-term project of researching the items in the house, engaging graduate students and college students to help us with that process and to give them some really special professional development experience along the way. And then to find interesting ways to share the stories that those objects offer with the general public by putting them on exhibit, by creating digital exhibits around them. And that's a project that is going to be rich terrain for us to explore for many years to come.
Okay.
And, oh yes.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. I thought you were done. Go ahead.
The other important aspect of our stewardship of the house has become the creation of a writer in residence program there. We feel like the best way to honor Hemingway's legacy is to support ongoing creative work. This is something that the Ken Burns, Lynn Novick documentary really underscores so powerfully. Like, it starts with his work. The man was a writer.
And for us to honor that by supporting writers today, by seeing that this spectacular natural landscape here can not only support and inspire wonderful outdoor physical adventures, but also great intellectual adventures and ongoing creative work, really is at the heart of what we want to do and what we feel is the highest and best use of the house.
Okay, so I just want to mention real quickly before I ask any more questions, if anyone who's participating tonight wants to ask a question, please feel free to submit it to me in the chat or raise your virtual hand and you will get an opportunity to ask your question. Gary, I'm going to go to you next. You've been to other Hemingway homes. So how is this approach that Jenny's describing to the one in Idaho, how is that different from the other homes you've seen, and what are your thoughts on those differences?
First, I would say that I have been to the Topping House in Ketchum. This was in, I think, about the early to mid 90s, something like that. I was just trout fishing in Idaho, and I wanted to go look at Hemingway's house. I saw the grave, and it was, in those days, you could actually walk. I hiked up a road with my spouse, and we looked at the house. We couldn't go any further than that. And we couldn't, of course, we didn't knock on the door or anything like that. Now I understand that, and I think that this is what Van Sauter was talking about, is that now the access is very limited. So I haven't been to the Finca Bahia, the house in Cuba, but I've been to the house in Key West. And I would add the 2 residences in Paris where Hemingway lived. The first off of the Rue Mouffetard, the Market Street, the winding Market Street, that's rather charming. And then also his later residence, both of them quite modest sites in Montparnasse, right around the corner from the cafe where he says he wrote In Our Time and Parts of Sun Also Rises and so on. It's called La Closerie des Lilas. I would add all these cafes as important sites as well. You know, Les Deux Magots, and I don't know, what are the other ones? The Brasserie Lippe and so forth. I would add these Paris cafes, you know, in a sense, maybe more important because he said that he wrote there. He met James Joyce and, you know, and Scott Fitzgerald and so forth, and all the people in The Sun Also Rises that he satirizes. He met all of them in these cafes and so forth. And then of course, and you can read about this in what I regard as his best book in a way, is A Movable Feast. I would add one thing about A Movable Feast. It was, the notes for A Movable Feast were completed in the Topping House, the Ketchum house. I think that's important, you know. Well, I also visited the house in Key West where he lived with Pauline Pfeiffer. You know, he fished for marlin, and he wrote a lot of books. He wrote A Farewell to Arms there, and Death in the Afternoon, the book about bullfighting. He wrote, let's see, he wrote To Have and Have Not, is his novel set in Key West. I think it's, I like the book a lot. I don't consider it as bad as everybody else seems to think it was, including Hemingway, I suppose, eventually. And then I would add, you know, the point about Mary spending the rest of her house in, the rest of her life in the house in Ketchum. Hemingway's second wife, Pauline Pfeiffer, lived for the rest of her life in the house in Key West. She entertained visitors. Tennessee Williams lived down the street in Key West. He came over to use the saltwater pool and so on. So, and of course, you know, the house in Key West, there's this army of 6-toed cats that people seem to be more interested in than they are, you know, in the writer who lived there and his spouse and so on. I read recently, isn't it Patrick Hemingway said that actually Hemingway didn't have any cats in Key West? And so that's an interesting detail, I thought. So, I mean, I can go on and on about this sort of stuff. I can talk about sloppy joes and so forth, but I think you know, my point is that I think about the house in Key West. It's a delight to visit it, but it's absolutely compromised as a research site now for people like me.
Okay, so you would say that the one in Idaho is not compromised then, right?
Yeah, enormous contrast, right?
Awesome.
Yeah, and that's of course, for someone like me, that's what you would want.
Okay, awesome. Van, you've written a book about Sun Valley, and of course, there's a part of that book that talks about Hemingway. You know, why is Hemingway's story such an important part of the Sun Valley story now?
Well, when he started going to Sun Valley, America was a very different country than it is today. We did not have professional football, basketball, baseball on television. Hollywood was not as fully magnified as it is today with celebrity. The internet didn't exist. There weren't a lot of large celebrities in America. I mean, we had actors, actresses, we had murderers, we had thieves and the occasional millionaire, but it was an entirely different celebrity canvas. And somehow Hemingway became probably the single best known non-president in America. He was known by everybody, and everybody had a different reason for liking him. So Hemingway, being in this little town, fundamentally transformed the town's self-identity. They were neighbors with the most famous man in America, on the cover of Look and Collier's and Life and Time, and who was writing these magnificent books. It changed the psyche of the town. And then post that, I think Hemingway has a unique appeal, particularly to American men. And I think this image of the fisherman, the hunter, the fornicator, the fist fighter has a certain kind of almost illicit allure, which adds to it. And Jenny's organization has turned this into something that is far more than celebrity and kind of tabloid attractiveness. She's turned it into a respectful environment where one can look at a great creative artist, the assets, the liabilities, and what it means. And I would correct one thing she said that is totally erroneous. The phrase Hemingway country originated with her. I stole it, but it was hers. But that's sort of what it was all about. And I think we live in a world where there's a tremendous amount of old men like me who, as they grew up, found their masculine identity through Hemingway characters. Between Hemingway and John Wayne, a whole generation of manhood was defined.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to take your word on that. Jenny, I'll go to you next. You know, this was touched on in the Idaho Experience episode a little bit, but, you know, Hemingway's life ended at that home, which can cast a shadow over it, certainly. But, you know, as we heard, it's an inspiring place for present day writers. Do you think any of them struggle with his death there, or do you think the beauty of the place and the serenity of it all just kind of overtakes them when they come there to stay?
I think it's really both. And I think that is, as we watched the Burns documentary clip, as we watched the Idaho Experience piece, we see how that is the power of Hemingway's work, is that he embraces the beauty of life and the violence of life, the sometimes casual violence, the sometimes dramatic violence as well. And so I think the house is all of that too. It is in this beautiful, peaceful, inspiring, natural location. And it is also a site of a violent act and of a death, and then healing. It is a space that held Mary's grief. She wrote that she had more friends per square mile in Idaho than any place else in the world. She held parties on the lawn on the anniversary of Hemingway's birthday each year, and it was a kind of community potluck affair. Mariel Hemingway has told us, Ernest's granddaughter, that that's how she came to know her grandfather, was through those community parties on the lawn of the house, because she was born after his death. So we, the library, are really interested in the houses, how the house is all of that. And I think in general, writers, artists, that's why they make art, is because they want to grapple with that complexity as well. And so I think it's part of the power of the space. As Naomi McDougall-Jones said in the Idaho Experience piece, I think different writers to different degrees feel like they confront Hemingway's ghost in literal or figurative ways there, and that's important to their creative process. As one of the writers in the opening to the Burns documentary says, you know, everybody's writing in Hemingway's wake. If you are a writer, at some point you are having to confront Hemingway's work, Hemingway's legacy. Sometimes that happens more immediately, more directly to writers who are in residence at the Hemingway House.
So I just want to share a comment that I got in the chat just now from Nancy, who's watching our discussion. She said she really liked what Van said about Hemingway being so famous for the time in which he lived, and she also appreciates what Jenny and the community library is doing with the Hemingway home. She says now she just needs to become a writer so that perhaps that she can absorb some of that atmosphere the house has held for other writers. So I thought that was fun to share. I guess that leads to my next question, in the sense that if the Idaho, well, since the Idaho home is open to writers and kind of private and not open to the public, are there any ways that the public can see that home, and are there any plans to make it more accessible in the future, Jenny?
Idaho Public Television, as they created the Idaho Experience episode that we all just viewed, they created a virtual tour of the house, which is really fantastic. And so that provides a very full experience of the house with stories behind the objects that are seen, and a really rich experience of the house. So that provides some tremendous access. And as we continue to learn about the provenance, the history and significance around objects in the house, we have and will continue to find ways to bring those out to public spaces to be exhibited at different times. And we think there is a lot we can continue to do digitally as well. You know, we really are committed to honoring the house as a home, as a site for a writer in residence to work. And if people want to connect with Hemingway in Idaho, I think really the best thing they can do is to go for a long walk. Hike along Trail Creek Road, hike in the high desert along Silver Creek, where he shot at ducks and magpies with the rancher Bud Purdy, get outdoors, and then have a big dinner with friends. And that is really the way to connect with Hemingway's time in Idaho.
Okay. Van, did you have something you wanted to say? You're waving your hand.
Well, I was just saying, you could also celebrate his history by going to any one of 2 or 3 bars and having a good solid drink. But I think one of the things that's worth noting is that the Hemingway house itself has a history. It just didn't happen there. The Topping man, who one of the prior individuals mentioned, this guy Topping had a ton of money out of New York. I think his family was in aluminum, but whatever, he was quite a playboy. And he was in the bar at the Sun Valley Lodge, where he spent a lot of time. And at the end of his evening, he wanted to sign a check. He didn't want to pay cash. And the bartender refused him. And Topping was outraged, walked out, said he was going to build his own house in Sun Valley, and he was through with the lodge. And not only did he build his own house, the Hemingway house, he built the exterior using the same modeling cement that the Sun Valley Lodge used. So there's a distinct physical relationship between the house and the lodge. Whatever Topping, probably had alimony to deal with or some kind of litigation, but he got out of the house and I think ended up spending a lot of time in Hollywood. But it was a playboy who created what we now know as the Hemingway house.
Awesome. Okay. Well, once again, I just want to remind those listening, if you have a question, send them to me in the chat or raise your virtual hand. I'm getting ready to ask the last question of the night. So if you'd like to get something in before we wrap up, please send it in the chat or raise your virtual hand. Gary, the question is for you. Jenny talked about the access to the home and how they have that managed. Van talked about the unique aspects of the home's history itself. As a scholar and a researcher, what value does the way this home has been preserved have for you and for studying Hemingway's legacy?
Well, thanks for letting me conclude. I don't know if I deserve the honor, but I'll do my best. I think places were essential to Hemingway as a literary artist. The place is crucial to this kind of precise writing idea that he has, to this meticulous use of language. And my sense is that when people think of the Ketchum House, if they know about it, they think of a suicide. But I'd note that, he was happy and productive in Sun Valley and Ketchum until, his mental health, physical health issues caught up with him. In the Ketchum House specifically, early 1960s, I think I mentioned this before, he finished writing the notes for what would become A Movable Feast, which the first edition of which Mary edited. And he has this point he makes in A Movable Feast I find very useful. He says that the writer can't write about a place while living in it, that the writer must gain some, sort of distance from the experience of that place. And he's specifically talking about Paris because A Movable Feast is focused on Paris. And it took 30 years for him to write about it. But I think it's important to realize that, to think about the fact that he finished writing the notes for A Movable Feast in the Hemingway house in Ketchum. And then, I don't think it's likely that the Ketchum house is going to face the fate of the Key West house. But of course, I think it's important to be vigilant about maintaining it. And I would say that, it should be preserved as much as possible as it was when Mary lived there, because it's not only a Hemingway material archive, but also probably the most important artifact of Mary Welsh's life.
Okay, wonderful. Well, we haven't had any more questions submitted. Oops, actually we do. Marty Brown has raised his hand. Marty, do you want to ask a question? If you could unmute. We can't hear you at the moment.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
I missed the title of the book of the female author who hiked alone. And I wonder if you could repeat that, her name and the title of her book.
Jenny, do you know that from the Idaho experience? Okay.
Yes, it's Wild by Cheryl Strayed.
Thank you. Cheryl Strayed, S-T-R-A.
Strayed, S-T-R-A-Y-E-D.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marty.
Thank you.
I don't think we have any other questions. I just want to let everyone know that in the chat, I have put the event survey that would be great. Oh, Jenny, do you have something?
I saw Paul Herring, I think, with his hand up.
Paul, did you have a question?
There we go. First
there
of all,
you go.
I'd like to thank Ohio University for putting on this symposium. And also, I want to acknowledge I have a connection with Van Sauter. He and I were classmates at Ohio University. Actually, he was a year ahead of me. We were in the same fraternity, and he was my big brother there. So I have that connection with this group. My question to either Van or to the other Hemingway scholars is, my conflict that I have between apparently Hemingway's love of nature and conservation, and yet his embracement of hunting and taking big game, which seems to me to be in conflict. And I wondered if those of you who are Hemingway scholars could share with me how he reconciled those two positions.
Well, I'll give it a try. I don't think he did reconcile it, actually. I do think he saw violence as being inherent to our experiences in the world, that it was an integral part of the natural world. And I think he, as I believe it was Lynn Novick said at the outset, he did have a fascination with death. That surfaces in all of his works. And so I think it was something that he did not reconcile, but wrestled with, and perhaps through the sport of hunting is one of the ways that he did so.
Van, Gary, do you have any thoughts on that you want to share?
Yeah, Van had his hand up, I think.
Well, I don't think I can add anything. I first of all want to say hello to my former brother in the bond at Phi Delta Theta. You're looking great, and I feel increasingly old. But I don't think it can be reconciled today, and I don't think it was reconciled in Hemingway's mind. I think he was an individual who was enthralled with expressions of violence. He was intrigued by war. He wrote about it well. He loved prize fighting. He was not above a brawl in a bar himself. And he enjoyed all aspects of hunting and fishing. But I think he had great respect for the creatures that he killed. And there's a dichotomy in that, but I think it's inherent to many people who hunt. And I think it finds a manifestation also in The Old Man in the Sea, where that fish, which is slowly chewed away by the sharks, becomes emblematic of something that's incredibly noble, and as is the fisherman himself.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Sherry, for coordinating this and bringing this symposium. And it was just wonderful to hear all of the participants. And Van, it's wonderful to see you. You're looking great yourself, I must say.
It's a keen disguise.
Well, I'm getting some questions in the chat about how you can view the home tour. I did just put that in the chat for everyone, the links to the tour. I also will send out a follow-up email to all of you who attended tomorrow with the link to the event survey and the tours. And we have a recording of this video that we're going to post. So if you missed any part of it, you could go back and watch. But I want to thank our panel, Lynn Novick, who had to go earlier, but it was great to have her here, and Jenny and Van and Gary, thank you so much for your time. And for everyone else who helped put together tonight's event, Idaho Public Television, of course, WETA and PBS, Florentine Films, and the Ohio University Alumni Association, who helped us get this out to OU alums to be able to be here tonight. We really, really appreciate it. So thank you all so very much for attending. This has been a great discussion. I've learned more than I could have ever imagined, and I really appreciate you all being here. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. Good night.